On the night of October 11th, 1909, 14 workers entered the coal preparation building of the Marrow Creek Mining Company in Harlan County, Kentucky, and never left. The building was locked from the inside. The machinery was still running. The oil lamps were still burning. But when the morning foreman arrived at 6 a.m. to change shifts, he found the workstations abandoned, the coal hoppers full, and the massive sorting conveyors moving through empty air. Not a single worker remained. Not a single body was found. And not a single explanation was ever recorded in the company's official incident log. What makes the disappearance impossible to dismiss is not the absence itself. Miners vanished frequently in 1909, lost to cave-ins, explosions, or simply walking away from brutal conditions. What makes it impossible is the evidence left behind. 14 lunch pails sat unopened on the workbenches, their contents still cold from the evening before. 14 time cards remained punched in at the clock near the entrance, stamped with arrival times between 6:47 p.m. and 6:58 p.m. on October 11th. 14 coats hung on pegs along the wall, pockets still containing tobacco tins, folded letters, coins. The men had not left voluntarily. They had not walked out. They had simply ceased to be there. The Marrow Creek Mining Company filed no missing persons reports. The local sheriff's office opened no investigation. The county newspaper published no obituaries. Within a week, the company had hired 14 replacement workers, reopened the preparation building, and resumed operations as if nothing had occurred. The families of the missing men were told their loved ones had abandoned their posts and would receive no final wages, no severance, no death benefits. Nothing, but one person refused to accept that answer. Margaret Holloway, wife of Thomas Holloway, one of the missing 14, wrote a letter to the State Labor Commission demanding an inquiry. She wrote, "My husband did not abandon his work. He did not abandon his family. Something happened in that building, and someone knows what it was." The letter was filed, stamped, and never answered. Margaret died in 1943, still waiting for a reply. And if you were her, standing outside that building in October 1909, watching the smoke rise from the stacks and knowing your husband was not coming home, what would you have done that she did not? Note the hour where you are. Note the light outside your window, because by the time this story ends, you will understand why some shifts never finish. The coal preparation building at Marrow Creek stood 3 stories tall, constructed of red brick and timber beams blackened by decades of coal dust. It was built in 1887, expanded in 1903, and by 1909 it processed over 400 tons of raw coal per day. The building sat at the base of a steep hillside, connected to the mine entrance by a rail line that carried coal carts down from the tunnels above. Inside, the coal was sorted, washed, and loaded into freight cars bound for steel mills in Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Cleveland. The work was grueling. The air inside the building was thick with dust that settled in the lungs and never left. The machinery, belt conveyors, crushing rollers, water sluices, was loud enough to drown out conversation. Men worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, for wages that barely covered rent in the company housing scattered along the hollow. Injuries were common. Deaths were not unusual. But the men kept working because there were no other jobs in Harlan County, and walking away meant eviction, blacklisting, and starvation. But there was something else about the preparation building, something the workers spoke of in low voices, away from the foreman. The building had a reputation. Men said the 3rd floor felt wrong, that the air up there was colder than it should be, that the machinery sometimes started on its own, even when the steam boilers were shut down, that shadows moved in the corners where the lamplight didn't reach. These were dismissed as superstitions, the kind of stories miners told to pass the time. But the stories persisted. In August 1909, 2 months before the disappearances, a worker named James Carver refused to return to the 3rd floor after his shift. He told the foreman, "There's something up there that don't belong." When pressed, he would not elaborate. He was fired the next day. When the disappearances occurred in October, James Carver was not among the missing. He had already left Marrow Creek, traveling west to find work in the Indiana coal fields. He never returned, and he never spoke publicly about what he had seen on the 3rd floor. But his dismissal was recorded in the company ledger. And the ledger is still preserved, archived in a county storage facility that smells of mildew and old paper. The entry reads, J. Carver, terminated for refusal of duty, final wages withheld. No further explanation, no record of what duty he had refused. Just a name, a date, and a decision to erase him from the payroll. The building still stands, abandoned since 1962. The windows are boarded, the doors are chained, and no one in Harlan County will go inside. October 11, 1909 was a Monday. The weather was clear, the temperature mild for mid-autumn. The night shift at the coal preparation building was scheduled to begin at 7 p.m. and end at 7 a.m. 14 men reported for duty. Their names were recorded in the timekeeper's log, a leather-bound ledger kept near the entrance to the building. The log still exists, stored in the archives of the Kentucky Labor History Project, its pages yellowed and brittle. The names were Thomas Holloway, age 34, Daniel Rourke, age 29, Samuel Briggs, age 41, Peter Kovac, age 26, Henry Dobbs, age 38, Jacob Finch, age 22, Martin Odell, age 31, William Cray, age 45, Leonard Moss, age 27, Arthur Kane, age 33, Charles Whitman, age 36, Joseph Brennan, age 24, Raymond Hall, age 39, Andrew Stiles, age 28. 14 men, 14 time cards punched. 14 arrivals documented between 6:47 p.m. and 6:58 p.m. The timekeeper on duty that night was a man named Edwin Cross, who later testified in a deposition that was never made public that nothing had seemed unusual. The men arrived, punched in, and entered the building. Edwin locked the main door behind them at 7:05 p.m., as was company protocol. The building was sealed from the outside until the end of the shift to prevent theft of coal or equipment. The only exit was through the main door, which could only be unlocked from the outside or through the coal chutes on the third floor, which opened onto a 20-foot drop into the rail yard below. Edwin Cross remained at the gate until midnight, when he was relieved by the night watchman. He saw no one leave the building. He heard no disturbances. He noticed nothing unusual. At midnight, he went home, unaware that by morning, the 14 men inside would be gone. The night watchman, a man named Oscar Trent, made his rounds every 2 hours. He walked the perimeter of the building, checking for broken windows, unlocked doors, signs of intrusion. His logbook, also preserved in the archives, shows entries at 12:15 a.m., 2:20 a.m., and 4:30 a.m. Each entry reads the same. All secure, no irregularities. At 6 a.m., Oscar unlocked the main door to allow the morning foreman inside. And that is when the discovery was made. The building was empty, the workers were gone, and no one had seen them leave. The morning foreman's name was Gilbert Ashford. He had worked for the Marrow Creek Mining Company for 11 years, rising from coal sorter to shift supervisor. He was known as a methodical man, strict but fair, who kept detailed records and rarely made errors. When he entered the preparation building at 6:05 a.m. on October 12, 1909, he expected to find the night shift finishing their work, preparing to hand over operations to the morning crew. Instead, he found silence. The machinery was still running, the conveyors turning, the water sluices flowing, the sorting hoppers moving coal from one level to the next. But there were no workers, no voices, no footsteps. Just the mechanical rhythm of the building, operating without human presence. Gilbert walked through the first floor, then the second, then climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the third floor. He found the workstations abandoned. Coal lay piled on the sorting tables waiting to be graded. Tools lay where they had been set down. Shovels, pry bars, brushes. Lunch pails sat unopened. Coats hung on pegs. Everything was in its place, except the men. Gilbert descended to the main floor and checked the time clock. 14 cards remained punched in. None had been punched out. He checked the main door. It was locked from the outside, as it should have been. He climbed back to the third floor and checked the coal chutes. They were closed, secured with iron latches that could only be opened from the inside. No signs of tampering. No evidence that anyone had climbed out. Gilbert Ashford did not immediately report the disappearance to the company office. He later testified, in the same sealed deposition as Edwin Cross, that he first assumed the men had somehow bypassed the locked door and left early, perhaps through a window or a side entrance he had not yet discovered. But after searching the building for over an hour, he found no other exits, no broken windows, no hidden doors. The building was sealed as it had been the night before, and the men were simply not there. At 7:30 a.m., Gilbert walked to the company office and informed the superintendent, a man named Harrison Ludlow, of the situation. Ludlow's response, according to Gilbert's testimony, was brief. "Lock the building. Say nothing. I will handle it." Gilbert did as instructed. He locked the building, sent the morning shift home, and waited. And by the time the company decided to act, it was already too late. The evidence had been disturbed, the scene had been altered, and the truth, if it had ever been accessible, was already slipping away. By noon on October 12th, the families of the missing men had begun to gather outside the company office. Word had spread quickly through the hollow. The night shift had not returned. Wives, children, parents, siblings stood in the cold autumn air, demanding answers. Margaret Holloway was among them. She had waited all morning for her husband to come home, and when he did not, she had walked the 2 miles from their company house to the mine entrance. She later wrote in a letter to her sister, "They told us to go home. They told us the men had walked off the job, but I knew Thomas would never do that. He would never leave without telling me. And I knew, standing there in the cold, that something terrible had happened. But no one would say what." The company superintendent, Harrison Ludlow, addressed the families from the steps of the office. He said the men had abandoned their posts and would be considered derelict in duty. He said the company would not be held responsible for their absence. He said final wages would be withheld until the men returned to explain themselves. And then he went inside and closed the door. The families did not disperse. They waited outside the office until nightfall, hoping for more information. Some of the women began to cry. Some of the men grew angry and demanded to search the preparation building themselves. But the company refused. The building remained locked. Guards were posted at the entrance, and the families were told repeatedly to go home and wait. By the next morning, most had given up. They returned to their homes, unsure of what to do. Unsure of whether their husbands and sons and fathers were dead, or lost, or simply gone. But Margaret Holloway did not give up. She went to the county sheriff's office and filed a missing persons report. The sheriff, a man named Walter Kemp, took her statement, wrote it down in a ledger, and told her he would investigate. He did not investigate. His ledger, later reviewed by researchers, contains a single line next to Margaret's report. "Company matter. No action required." Margaret wrote her letter to the State Labor Commission 2 days later, and when she received no response, she wrote again and again. Over the next 3 months, she sent 7 letters. None were answered, and by January 1910, she stopped writing. Not because she had given up, but because she had received a visit. A man came to her house. He did not give his name. He told her that continued inquiries would result in her eviction from company housing. He told her that her husband's disappearance was regrettable but final. And he told her that any further attempts to involve outside authorities would be inadvisable. Margaret never wrote another letter. She lived in the company house until 1918, when she remarried and moved to Virginia. She never spoke publicly about her husband again. But she kept every letter she had written to the Labor Commission preserved in a cedar box that was passed down through her family. The letters were donated to a historical archive in 2004, and it was only then that researchers learned how hard she had fought, and how completely she had been silenced. There was no official investigation into the disappearance of the 14 workers. No inquest, no coroner's report, no testimony taken under oath. The company did not request assistance from county authorities. The sheriff did not press the matter. The State Labor Commission, despite receiving multiple letters from Margaret Holloway, took no action. But there was one man who tried. His name was Samuel Corbin, a reporter for the Harlan County Ledger, a weekly newspaper that served the mining communities scattered throughout the region. Samuel had covered mining accidents before, cave-ins, explosions, labor disputes, and he knew that 14 men did not simply vanish without cause. He arrived at Marrow Creek on October 14th, 2 days after the disappearance, hoping to interview company officials and examine the preparation building. He was denied access. Harrison Ludlow, the company's superintendent, refused to speak with him. The guards at the building entrance turned him away. Samuel attempted to interview the families of the missing men, but most were reluctant to speak, fearing retaliation from the company. Only Margaret Holloway agreed to an interview. She told him everything: the locked building, the untouched belongings, the company's refusal to investigate. Samuel returned to his office and wrote an article. The article was titled, "14 Men Missing from Marrow Creek, Company Silent." He submitted it to the editor of the Ledger, a man named Theodore Marsh, who had published Samuel's work for over 5 years. Theodore read the article, then set it aside. He called Samuel into his office and said, "This will not be printed." Samuel asked why. Theodore said, "The company advertises with us, they pay well, and they do not want this story told." Samuel argued. He said the families deserved answers. He said the public had a right to know. Theodore said, "The public will know what the company allows them to know, and if you insist on pursuing this, you will no longer work here." Samuel left the office. He did not resign. He simply stopped coming to work. 2 weeks later, he moved to Ohio and took a job with a Cincinnati newspaper. He never wrote about Marrow Creek again, but he kept a copy of the unpublished article tucked inside a notebook that was discovered in 2017 among his personal effects. The article still exists. It was never printed, but it remains the only contemporaneous account of the disappearance written by someone who tried to uncover the truth. The article ends with a single line: "Something happened in that building, and someone is ensuring it will never be known." On October 19, 1909, 1 week after the disappearance, the coal preparation building reopened. 14 new workers were hired. The machinery was restarted. Operations resumed as if nothing had occurred. The company issued no statement. The local newspaper published no announcement. The building simply returned to service, processing coal as it always had, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. But the new workers knew something was wrong. They had heard the stories. They had seen the families standing outside the company office, demanding answers that never came. And they had walked through the building, seeing the lunch pails, the coats, the tools left behind by men who had never returned. One of the new workers, a man named Frank Delano, later told his grandson, in a recorded interview conducted in 1978, 69 years after the disappearance, that the building felt cursed. He said the men were afraid to work there, but they had no choice. Jobs were scarce. Refusing work meant eviction. So they clocked in, kept their heads down, and tried not to think about what had happened to the men before them. Frank said the company had cleaned the building before reopening it. The lunch pails had been removed, the coats had been taken down, the tools had been replaced, but there were still traces, stains on the floorboards that looked like rust but weren't, scratches on the walls that looked deliberate, and on the third floor, in the northwest corner where the sorting hoppers dumped coal into the freight chutes, there was a smell. Not coal dust, not oil, something else, something organic, something that made the men avoid that corner whenever possible. Frank worked at Marrow Creek for 3 years. He never went to the third floor unless ordered to, and when his shift ended, he left quickly, never looking back. He said you could feel it up there, something watching you, something that didn't want you there. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not believe in superstitions, but he believed that something had happened in that building, and he believed it had not been resolved. Frank Delano died in 1981. His grandson donated the recorded interview to the Kentucky Oral History Project in 2003, and it remains one of the few first-hand accounts of what it was like to work in the preparation building after the disappearance. One of the few testimonies from someone who was there, who felt the weight of what had been left behind, and one of the few voices willing to say out loud that the building should never have reopened. Edwin Cross, the timekeeper who had locked the building on the night of October 11th, gave 2 accounts of what he had seen. The first account was given verbally to the company superintendent, Harrison Ludlow, on the morning of October 12th. No written record of this conversation exists, but the second account was given under deposition on November 3, 1909, in a closed hearing convened by the company's legal counsel. The deposition was never filed with any court. It was never made public. But it survived in the company's private records, which were donated to a university archive in 1998 after the Marrow Creek Mining Company dissolved. In the deposition, Edwin described locking the building at 7:05 p.m., as he always did. He said the 14 men had entered without incident. He said he had seen nothing unusual. He said he had remained at the gate until midnight, then been relieved by the night watchman. He said he had gone home and learned of the disappearance the next morning. But researchers examining the deposition in 2019 noticed something. There were strike-through marks on the transcript, sentences that had been started, then crossed out, then rewritten, and in the margins, in faint pencil, were notes written by the company attorney conducting the deposition. One note read, "Revise, do not include." Another read, "Omit reference to noise." The strike-through sentences, still faintly visible beneath the ink, revealed what Edwin had initially said. He had heard a noise. Around 10:30 p.m., a sound coming from inside the building. He described it as a grinding like metal on metal, but louder. He had walked to the building and listened at the door. The sound had stopped. He had assumed it was the machinery malfunctioning. He had not entered the building. He had returned to the gate. But that passage was crossed out. And in the final version of the deposition, Edwin said he had heard nothing. Why was that detail removed? Why did the company's attorney instruct Edwin to revise his testimony? And what did the sound mean? Edwin Cross left Marrow Creek in December 1909. He moved to West Virginia and took a job as a railroad clerk. He never spoke publicly about the disappearance. He died in 1947, and his personal papers were destroyed by his family, as requested in his will. But the deposition remains, and the strike-through marks remain. And they suggest that Edwin saw or heard something that the company did not want documented. Something that contradicted the official narrative that the men had simply walked away. Something that suggested they had not left voluntarily. Oscar Trent, the night watchman who had made rounds on the night of October 11th, worked for the Marrow Creek Mining Company for 6 years. His logbook showed consistent, meticulous entries. Rounds completed every 2 hours, no missed shifts, no irregularities. But on October 17, 1909, 5 days after the disappearance of the 14 workers, Oscar Trent did not report for his shift. The company sent someone to his boarding house. The landlord said Oscar had left that morning with a single bag, paid his rent through the end of the month, and said he was moving on. He did not say where. He did not leave a forwarding address. He simply walked out the door and never returned. The company did not search for him. They did not file a missing persons report. They hired a replacement watchman and continued operations. Oscar's final paycheck was mailed to the boarding house, marked return to sender, and eventually filed away in the company's payroll records. But there was something else in Oscar's file. A handwritten note, clipped to his employment record, dated October 15th, 2 days before he disappeared. The note read, "O. Trent requests reassignment. States he will not continue night watch at Prep Building. Claims unsafe conditions. Request denied." The note was unsigned. But it was filed alongside Oscar's termination paperwork, which was dated October 18th, 1 day after he left. The termination was listed as voluntary resignation, but the timeline suggests otherwise. Oscar had asked to be reassigned. The company had refused, and the next day he had left without warning. Researchers have attempted to trace Oscar Trent's movements after October 1909. No records exist, no census entries, no employment records, no death certificate. He vanished as completely as the 14 men he had been watching over on the night of their disappearance. But there is one clue. In 1952, a man claiming to be Oscar Trent's nephew wrote a letter to the Kentucky Historical Society asking if they had any information about his uncle, who he said had worked at a mine in Harlan County and left under mysterious circumstances. The letter included a single detail. "My uncle told my father, before he left Kentucky, that he had seen something at the mine that he could not explain. He said he would not speak of it, and that we should not ask. He said some things were better left unknown." The nephew provided no contact information. The letter was filed and never answered. And Oscar Trent, like the 14 men before him, was never seen again. There is no medical record of the disappearance. No autopsy reports, no death certificates, no physician's statement. But company records show that a doctor was summoned to the preparation building on the morning of October 12th, shortly after the discovery. His name was Dr. Horace Lindell, a general practitioner who served the mining communities in Harlan County and was frequently called to the scene of industrial accidents. Dr. Lindell's account book, preserved in a county medical archive, shows an entry for October 12, 1909. Marrow Creek Mining Co., Consultat Prep Building. No examination performed. $5. No examination performed. The entry suggests Dr. Lindell arrived at the building, was paid for his time, but did not examine any patients. Because there were no patients, there were no bodies, there were no injured workers, there was nothing to examine. But why was he called? Company protocol required medical evaluation only in cases of injury or death. If the workers had simply abandoned their posts, as the company claimed, there would have been no need to summon a doctor. So what did the company expect him to find? Dr. Lindell never spoke publicly about the visit. But in 1923, 14 years after the disappearance, he wrote a letter to a colleague in Lexington, discussing his years of medical practice in the coal fields. Near the end of the letter, he mentioned the Marrow Creek incident in a single paragraph. I was called to examine a site where men had vanished. I found no evidence of foul play, no blood, no signs of struggle, but I felt an unease in that place that I cannot adequately describe. I was asked to certify that no medical intervention was required. I signed the statement and left. I have never returned to that building, and I have no desire to. The statement he signed was never filed with any public authority. It was kept in the company's private records, and it has never been located. But the letter confirms that Dr. Lindell was asked to provide a medical opinion, not on missing men, but on the absence of evidence. He was there to confirm that there was nothing to find, and he confirmed it. And the investigation, such as it was, ended before it began. The machinery inside the coal preparation building was designed to operate continuously during shifts, powered by a coal-fired steam boiler located in a separate outbuilding 50 yards to the east. The boiler supplied steam through underground pipes to drive the conveyors, crushers, and sluices that processed the coal. When a shift ended, the machinery was shut down, the steam pressure was released, and the boiler was banked to conserve fuel overnight. But on the morning of October 12th, when Gilbert Ashford entered the building, the machinery was still running. The conveyors were turning, the water was flowing, the sorting hoppers were moving coal from one level to the next. It had been running all night, unsupervised, with no workers to monitor it. This was noted in Gilbert's deposition. He stated, "The machinery should have been shut down at the end of the shift. It was company policy. But it was running when I arrived. I assumed the men had left it on by mistake. But when I checked the boiler, I found it had been stoked. Someone had added coal to the firebox during the night. The fire was still burning hot." This detail is significant. If the workers had abandoned their posts early in the shift, as the company claimed, the boiler would have run out of fuel within a few hours. The machinery would have stopped, but the boiler had been tended. Someone had kept it running. And if the 14 men were gone, then who had stoked the fire? Gilbert's testimony on this point was not pursued. The company attorney did not ask follow-up questions. The deposition moved on to other topics. But the detail remained, buried in the transcript, suggesting that someone had been in the boiler house during the night. Someone who knew how to maintain steam pressure. Someone who was not one of the 14 missing men. Or something. The boiler was shut down on October 12th and restarted on October 19th when the building reopened. No irregularities were noted. No damage was found. The machinery continued to operate for another 53 years until the mine closed in 1962. But the workers who tended the boiler after 1909 reported strange occurrences. Tools going missing. Shovels moved from where they had been left. The fire burning hotter than it should, even when no coal had been added. These were dismissed as carelessness, inattention, the kind of mistakes tired men make at the end of long shifts. But the reports continued, and they were always the same. The boiler seemed to run itself, as if someone or something was still tending it, long after the men who had known how were gone. In the weeks following the disappearance, the families of the missing men waited for confirmation. They waited for bodies to be found, for remains to be recovered, for some evidence that their loved ones were dead so they could grieve, bury them, and move on. But no bodies were found, no remains were recovered, no evidence of death was ever produced. This created a legal problem. Without a death certificate, the families could not claim inheritance. Without proof of death, they could not remarry. Without bodies, they could not hold funerals. They existed in a state of suspension, unable to mourn and unable to move forward. Margaret Holloway petitioned the county court in 1911 to have her husband declared legally dead, so she could claim his pension and remarry. The petition was denied. The judge ruled that insufficient time had passed and that there was no evidence of death. Margaret appealed. The appeal was denied. She petitioned again in 1913, again denied. It was not until 1917, 8 years after the disappearance, that the state of Kentucky passed a law allowing individuals to be declared dead after 7 years of unexplained absence. Only then could the families begin to close the legal and financial gaps left by the disappearance. Only then could they begin to rebuild. But the emotional gaps never closed. The children of the missing men grew up without fathers, the wives grew old without husbands, and the question remained unanswered and unanswerable. What happened to them? One of the widows, a woman named Catherine Briggs, kept a journal in the years following her husband's disappearance. The journal was donated to a historical society in 1989 by her granddaughter. In the journal, Catherine wrote, "I dream of him every night. He is standing in a dark place and he is calling to me, but I cannot hear what he says. And when I wake, I feel as though he is still there, somewhere, waiting for me to find him. But I do not know where to look, and I do not think I ever will." Catherine Briggs died in 1951. She never remarried. She was buried beside an empty grave marked with her husband's name. The grave has no dates of death, just his name and the word missing. There is no photograph of the preparation building's interior, as it was found on October 12, 1909. No image of the abandoned workstations, the untouched lunch pails, the coats hanging on pegs. Photographic documentation of industrial sites was not uncommon in 1909. Insurance companies, labor inspectors, and newspapers frequently commissioned photographs of factories, mines, and mills. But the Marrow Creek Mining Company did not authorize any photographs of the scene. This absence is notable. In other mining disasters, explosions, cave-ins, fires, photographs were taken as evidence to document the damage, to assign responsibility, to support insurance claims. But the preparation building was not photographed. It was cleaned, restocked, and reopened within a week, as if the company wanted no permanent record of what had been found. But there is one photograph. It is not of the interior. It is an exterior shot, taken sometime in late 1909, showing the preparation building from a distance. The photograph is part of a larger collection documenting mining operations in Harlan County, compiled by a traveling photographer named Arthur Pembroke. The photograph was never published. It was stored in Pembroke's studio archive and later donated to the Library of Congress in 1963. The photograph shows the building in daylight, the windows dark, the smokestacks cold. But there is something in the image that was not noticed until researchers examined a high-resolution scan in 2021. In one of the third-floor windows, barely visible against the darkness inside, is a shape. It is indistinct, blurred, but it resembles a human figure, standing, facing outward. The photograph was taken weeks after the building had been cleaned and reopened. The figure could be a worker, or a shadow, or a defect in the glass plate. But enhancement software applied to the image suggests it is not a reflection. It is something inside the building, something that was there when the photograph was taken. And if it was a worker, why were they standing motionless in the window, staring out at nothing in the middle of a shift? The photograph is now part of the Library of Congress digital archive. It can be viewed online. And if you look closely at the third-floor window, you can see it. The shape, the figure. The thing that should not be there. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In 1962, the Marrow Creek Mining Company ceased operations. The coal seams had been exhausted, the market had shifted to oil and natural gas, and the cost of maintaining aging equipment had become unsustainable. The mine closed, the workers were laid off, the buildings were abandoned, and the company dissolved, its assets sold, its records archived. But when researchers attempted to access the company's records in the 1990s, they found that most had been destroyed. Payroll ledgers, incident reports, correspondence, legal documents, all had been disposed of in 1965, according to a brief notation in the archive catalog. The reason given was space constraints. But the timing is suspicious. The records were destroyed just 3 years after the mine closed, while many of the workers who had been employed there were still alive. What survived was fragmentary. Employment records for some years, but not others. Financial statements for some months, but not all. And the depositions taken in November 1909. The testimonies of Edwin Cross, Gilbert Ashford, and Oscar Trent, which had been misfiled and survived by accident. But there is no incident report for October 11, 1909. No internal investigation, no correspondence between the company and county authorities, no insurance claims, no legal filings. It is as if the disappearance never happened. As if the 14 men never existed. Except they did exist. Their names appear in the time ledger. Their families mourned them. Their widows fought for recognition. And their absence left a void that no amount of archival erasure could fill. The destruction of the records was deliberate. Researchers have found no other explanation. The company wanted the story to disappear along with the men, and for over a century, it almost did. But the story survived. In fragments, in letters, in depositions, in testimonies passed down through families. And now, it is being told again, not because the records were preserved, but because the silence was finally broken. Among the workers at Marrow Creek was a man named Victor Hale, a mechanical engineer responsible for maintaining the equipment in the preparation building. Victor had worked for the company since 1905 and was regarded as one of the most skilled engineers in the region. He had designed improvements to the conveyor system, repaired machinery that others deemed unsalvageable, and trained younger workers in equipment maintenance. But on October 13, 1909, the day after the disappearance, Victor submitted his resignation. He provided no explanation. He did not request a transfer. He simply left. The company tried to convince him to stay, offering higher wages, better hours, even a promotion. Victor refused. He left Harlan County and moved to Tennessee, where he took a job with a textile mill far from the coal fields. Victor's son, interviewed in 1982 by a local historian, said his father never spoke of Marrow Creek. He would not allow the name to be mentioned in our house. If anyone asked where he had worked before Tennessee, he would change the subject. The only thing he ever said was that he had seen something that made him leave. He would not say what. He would not even hint at it. And when I pressed him, he told me to stop asking. He said some knowledge was dangerous. Victor Hale died in 1956. His personal papers were destroyed at his request. But his employment record at Marrow Creek still exists, filed in the company archive. And attached to his resignation letter is a handwritten note written by Harrison Ludlow, the company's superintendent. The note reads, "V. Hale termination voluntary. Do not pursue. Do not contact." The company did not pursue him. They let him go without question. And the note suggests they knew why he left, that they understood what he had seen, and that they agreed it was better not to speak of it. Victor Hale was one of the few people who walked away from Marrow Creek and lived a full life afterward. But he carried the weight of what he had seen until the day he died. And whatever it was, he took it to the grave. In 2003, a team of industrial archaeologists received permission to survey the abandoned Marrow Creek mine site as part of a project documenting Kentucky's coal mining heritage. They mapped the surface structures, photographed the remaining buildings, and used ground-penetrating radar to locate the sealed mine shafts beneath the hillside. During the survey, they discovered something unexpected. Beneath the coal preparation building, there was a tunnel. It was not marked on any of the original blueprints. It was not mentioned in any company records. But it was there, running from the building's foundation northward into the hillside, extending approximately 200 feet before ending in a sealed chamber. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person to walk through. The walls were shored with timber beams consistent with 1890s mining construction. The floor was uneven, sloping downward, and at the end of the tunnel, the sealed chamber was roughly 12 feet square, with no visible purpose, no equipment, no storage, no connection to the main mine shafts. The archaeologists documented the tunnel and noted it in their report as an unexplained structural feature, possibly related to ventilation or emergency egress. But the report also noted something else. The tunnel had been sealed deliberately. The entrance, located in the basement of the preparation building, had been bricked over and covered with concrete. The ceiling was not visible from inside the building. It was hidden behind a false wall that had been constructed sometime after 1909. Why would the company build a tunnel and then seal it? And why would they hide the entrance? The archaeologists did not attempt to excavate the sealed chamber. The site was unstable, the timbers were rotting, and entering the tunnel would have been dangerous. But they took soil samples from the tunnel entrance and sent them to a lab for analysis. The results were disturbing. The soil contained traces of human organic material, skin cells, hair, biological residue, in concentrations consistent with prolonged human presence. Not from a single individual, from multiple individuals. And the material was old, dating to the early 20th century. The lab report concluded, sample suggests the tunnel was occupied or used for human activity during the period 1900 to 1920. Further investigation recommended. No further investigation was conducted. The site was closed to access, the tunnel remained sealed. And the question remains, what was that chamber used for? And who was inside it? In 2011, a descendant of Thomas Holloway, one of the missing 14, donated a box of family papers to the Kentucky Historical Society. Among the papers was an unsealed envelope addressed to Margaret Holloway, Thomas's wife. The envelope was postmarked October 10, 1909, one day before the disappearance. But the letter inside had never been mailed. It had been returned to the sender, marked undeliverable, and eventually filed away among family documents. The letter was from Thomas. It was written in pencil on a torn piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was hurried, the spelling inconsistent. Thomas had little formal education, and his letters were always brief and functional. But this letter was different. It was urgent. The letter read, "Maggie, I need you to listen. Something is wrong at the mine. The company is making us work in a place we should not be. They say it is safe, but it is not. Last night I saw something down there that I cannot explain. I do not want to go back. But if I do not, they will fire me, and we will lose the house. I am writing this so you know. If something happens to me, go to the sheriff. Tell him to look in the tunnel under the prep building. Tell him there are things down there that should not be. I love you, Thomas." The letter was never delivered. It had been dropped in a company mailbox, where outgoing mail was supposed to be collected and taken to the post office. But someone had intercepted it. Someone had marked it undeliverable and returned it to Thomas. And the next day, Thomas had gone to work, and he had never come back. The letter is now preserved in an archival sleeve, stored in a temperature-controlled vault. It is the only direct testimony from one of the missing men, the only evidence that they knew something was wrong, the only proof that they had tried to warn someone. But the warning was intercepted. The letter was suppressed. And Thomas Holloway disappeared, along with 13 others, into a silence that has lasted over a century. The letter ends with a single line. Tell him to look in the tunnel. But no one looked. Not in 1909. Not for over 90 years. And by the time anyone did, the tunnel had been sealed, and whatever was inside, it had been buried. In 1998, a graduate student named Lauren Michaels was researching labor practices in early 20th century coal mines for her dissertation. She requested access to the Marrow Creek Mining Company's financial records, which had been donated to a university archive after the company dissolved. Most of the records had been destroyed, but a few ledgers had survived, including the payroll records for 1909. Lauren was examining the payroll for October 1909 when she noticed something odd. The 14 men who disappeared on October 11th were listed as having worked that shift. Their hours were recorded. Their wages were calculated. But the wages were never paid. Instead, next to each name was a notation: payment withheld, per company directive. This matched the company's public stance that the men had abandoned their posts and forfeited their wages. But Lauren noticed something else. The payroll ledger showed an additional entry, dated October 12th, the day after the disappearance. The entry listed a payment of $350 made to contractor services, prep building maintenance. No name was given, no invoice number, just the amount and a vague description. $350 in 1909 was a significant sum, equivalent to nearly 3 months' wages for a coal sorter. Why would the company pay such a large amount for maintenance the day after 14 workers vanished? And why was the payment made to an unnamed contractor? Lauren attempted to trace the payment. She searched for invoices, receipts, correspondence. She found nothing. The payment appeared in the ledger, but there was no supporting documentation. It was as if the company had paid someone to do something they did not want documented. Lauren's dissertation, completed in 2001, included a chapter on the Marrow Creek disappearance. She concluded, "The financial records suggest the company engaged external services immediately following the incident. The nature of these services is unknown, but the timing and amount suggest they were related to concealing or resolving the situation. Whether this involved disposal of evidence, intimidation of witnesses, or something else cannot be determined from available records." The dissertation is now part of the university's digital archive. It has been cited in several subsequent studies of labor history and mining safety. But the $350 payment remains unexplained. And the question remains, who was paid, and what did they do? Gilbert Ashford, the morning foreman who discovered the empty building on October 12th, continued to work for the Marrow Creek Mining Company until 1923, when the operation downsized and he was laid off. He moved to Lexington, where he worked as a warehouse supervisor until his retirement in 1941. He died in 1949, at the age of 73. Gilbert never spoke publicly about the disappearance. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoirs. His deposition, taken in November 1909, remains sealed in company records and was not discovered until 1998. But Gilbert's daughter, in a letter written in 1987 to a friend, mentioned that her father had been troubled by something that happened at the mine. The letter, donated to a historical archive in 2005, reads, "My father was a practical man. He did not believe in superstition or ghost stories, but there was something that happened at Marrow Creek that he would never discuss. I asked him about it once, when I was a teenager, and he told me never to speak of it again. He said he had been ordered to keep silent, and that breaking that silence would put our family in danger. I never asked again, but I saw the weight of it in his eyes. Whatever he saw, whatever he knew, it haunted him until the day he died." Gilbert's personal papers were destroyed after his death as instructed in his will. His daughter said he had specifically requested that all correspondence, journals, and documents related to his time at Marrow Creek be burned. She complied, and whatever Gilbert knew, it was lost. But his deposition remains, and in it he described finding the building empty, the machinery running, and the workers gone. And he described one detail that was later struck from the final transcript. He said, "I found something on the 3rd floor, a mark on the wall. It looked like handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the coal dust, like someone had been clawing at the wall. I reported it to the superintendent. He told me to clean it. I did. And then he told me to forget I saw it." That passage was crossed out. It does not appear in the final version of the deposition, but it is still visible beneath the strike-through marks, and it suggests that the men did not leave voluntarily. They were trying to escape, and something prevented them. Margaret Holloway did not give up, even after her letters to the Labor Commission went unanswered, even after the company threatened her with eviction, even after decades had passed. She kept searching, she kept asking, she kept trying to find an answer. In 1932, 23 years after the disappearance, Margaret traveled to the state capitol and requested a meeting with the governor's office. She was turned away. She wrote to the U.S. Department of Labor, No response. She contacted newspapers, church groups, labor unions. Most ignored her. A few expressed sympathy but offered no assistance. In 1938, Margaret attended a public hearing on mine safety legislation in Frankfurt. She stood during the public comment period and described the disappearance of her husband and the 13 others. She demanded an investigation. She asked why no one had been held accountable. The chairman of the hearing thanked her for her testimony and moved on to the next speaker. No investigation was opened. Margaret died in 1943, at the age of 62. She was buried in a cemetery outside Haarlem, next to an empty plot reserved for her husband, who was never found. Her obituary, published in a local newspaper, made no mention of Thomas or the disappearance. It listed her survivors, her church membership, and the date of the funeral. It was as if the most significant event of her life had never happened. But Margaret left behind one final document, a handwritten will filed with the county clerk's office, in which she left her estate, a modest sum of savings and a few personal belongings, to any person or organization that succeeds in determining the fate of the 14 men who disappeared from Marrow Creek on October 11, 1909. The will included a provision that the funds be held in trust until such determination was made. The funds remained in trust until 1980, when a probate court ruled that the condition could not be satisfied and the estate should be distributed to Margaret's distant relatives. The money was dispersed, the trust was closed, and Margaret's final wish went unfulfilled. But her will remains on file, and it stands as a testament to a woman who refused to forget, who refused to accept that her husband had simply walked away, who knew in her heart that something terrible had happened, and who spent her life trying to make someone listen. Samuel Corbin, the reporter who tried to investigate the disappearance in October 1909, did move to Ohio. He did take a job with the Cincinnati newspaper, but he did not forget Marrow Creek. In 1911, 2 years after the disappearance, he wrote another article. This time he submitted it to a national magazine, The American Worker, a publication focused on labor issues and industrial safety. The article was more detailed than his first attempt. It included interviews with Margaret Holloway, descriptions of the company's refusal to investigate, and questions about the sealed records. It also included a new piece of information. Samuel had spoken with a former Marrow Creek employee who claimed that the company had discovered something in the mine tunnels in 1907, something that had prompted the construction of the hidden tunnel beneath the preparation building. The employee, who refused to be named, told Samuel they found a chamber deep in the hillside. It was not part of the original mine. It was older, much older, and there were things inside it. Bones, objects, symbols on the walls. The company sealed it and told no one, but they built that tunnel to access it, and they made us work near it, even though we knew something was wrong. Samuel's article was accepted for publication. It was scheduled to appear in the March 1912 issue of The American Worker, but it never ran. The magazine's editor received a letter from the Marrow Creek Mining Company's legal counsel, threatening a lawsuit for defamation if the article was published. The editor, unwilling to risk legal action, pulled the article. Samuel protested. He offered to revise the article, to remove the anonymous testimony, to soften the accusations. The editor refused. The article was killed, and Samuel, frustrated and defeated, stopped writing about Marrow Creek, but he kept the manuscript. And in 1952, 6 years after his death, his widow donated his papers to a journalism archive. The manuscript was included, and in 2016, a researcher found it, scanned it, and uploaded it to a digital repository. The article is now publicly available. It can be read online. And it contains details that were never reported in 1909. Details about the tunnel, about the sealed chamber, about the company's knowledge that something was wrong. And it ends with a question. If the company knew the tunnels were dangerous, why did they continue to send men down there? And if they discovered something they did not understand, why did they hide it instead of seeking help? The question was never answered, and 57 years later, 14 men disappeared. In 2018, a team of geologists surveying the Marrow Creek site used ground-penetrating radar to map the subsurface geology. They were looking for abandoned mine shafts, assessing the stability of the land for potential redevelopment. But what they found was unexpected. Beneath the hillside, approximately 300 feet from the preparation building, was a large void. It was not a mine shaft. It was a natural cavern, roughly 40 feet in diameter, with irregular walls and a high ceiling. The cavern appeared to predate the mine by thousands of years. It was part of the region's limestone karst geology, a network of caves and sinkholes common in central Kentucky. But the radar also detected something else. Structures inside the cavern. Not natural formations. Constructed features. Walls, chambers, something built by human hands. The geologists consulted with archaeologists, who reviewed the radar data and confirmed the presence of man-made structures. The structures appeared to be ancient, pre-Columbian, possibly constructed by indigenous peoples who inhabited the region hundreds or thousands of years before European settlement. But the most significant finding was this. The tunnel discovered beneath the preparation building in 2003 led directly to the cavern. The company had not built the tunnel to access a new coal seam. They had built it to reach the ancient chamber, and whatever they found inside, they had sealed it away. The archaeologists petitioned for permission to excavate the site. The petition was denied by the current landowner, citing safety concerns and environmental regulations. The site remains closed. The cavern remains unexplored. And the question remains, what did the company find in 1907? And how is it connected to the disappearance in 1909? One of the geologists in an interview conducted in 2020 said, "The radar shows something in that cavern that does not match any known geological formation. It is dense, symmetrical, and located at the center of the chamber. It could be a rock formation, it could be a collapsed structure, or it could be something else. But without excavation, we cannot know, and I do not think we will ever be allowed to find out." The radar images are now part of the Geological Survey archive. They show the cavern, they show the tunnel, and they show the object at the center of the chamber, a dark, dense mass that reflects radar waves in a way that suggests it is not natural. And if it is not natural, then what is it? In 2019, a researcher named Dr. Alan Porter, an anthropologist specializing in indigenous cultures of the southeastern United States, reviewed the Geological Survey data from Marrow Creek. He was particularly interested in the ancient structures detected inside the cavern. He requested access to any historical documentation that might reference the site. What he found was a single photograph taken in 1907, stored in the archives of the Kentucky Geological Survey. The photograph showed the interior of a cavern, not the Marrow Creek Cavern specifically, but one nearby, documented during a regional survey. On the walls of the cavern were markings, carved symbols, spirals, concentric circles, angular patterns. The symbols were consistent with indigenous petroglyphs found throughout the region, dating to the Mississippian culture, approximately 800 to 1600 CE. Dr. Porter compared the symbols to known indigenous iconography. Some matched, others did not. And among the unidentified symbols was one that appeared repeatedly, a circle within a circle, with lines radiating outward, like a sun or a wheel. Dr. Porter had seen that symbol before, not in indigenous petroglyphs, but in folklore. In stories collected from Appalachian communities in the early 20th century, there were references to sun marks, symbols carved by the old ones, to mark places that were not to be disturbed. The stories were vague, fragmented, passed down through oral tradition. But the symbol was consistent. Dr. Porter's research paper, published in 2020, proposed that the ancient chamber beneath Marrow Creek had been a ritual site, that the indigenous peoples who constructed it had marked it as sacred or forbidden, and that the Marrow Creek Mining Company, in their pursuit of coal, had breached that site and disturbed something that had been sealed for centuries. The paper was met with skepticism by the academic community. Critics argued that Dr. Porter was conflating folklore with archaeology, reading meaning into symbols that might have been decorative or territorial rather than protective. But Dr. Porter stood by his conclusions. He wrote, "The Marrow Creek workers disappeared 2 years after the company breached the chamber. The timing is not coincidental. They disturbed something, and that disturbance had consequences. Dr. Porter died in 2023. His research remains controversial, but his paper raised a question that had not been asked before. What if the disappearance was not an industrial accident? What if it was the result of something the company had awakened? In 1963, a man named Elias Stanton was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in eastern Kentucky. He was 74 years old, suffering from dementia, and had been found wandering along a roadside, disoriented and distressed. During his stay at the hospital, he spoke frequently about his time as a coal miner. The staff recorded some of his statements in his medical file. One entry, dated March 1963, reads, "Patient states he worked at Marrow Creek in 1909. Claims he was scheduled to work the night shift on October 11th but was sent home due to illness. States the men who worked that shift went into the dark and did not come back. Patient becomes agitated when questioned further. States they opened the door and something came through. Patient insists the company knows what happened and demands to speak with authorities. Medication administered." Elias Stanton died in the hospital 6 weeks later. His medical records were archived and forgotten for over 50 years. They were rediscovered in 2018 during a digitization project. A researcher reviewing the files noticed the reference to Marrow Creek and flagged it for further investigation. If Elias's account is accurate, then he was supposed to work the night shift on October 11th, 1909. He would have been among the 14 missing men, but he was sent home due to illness, and by pure chance he was spared. Researchers attempted to verify Elias's employment at Marrow Creek. The company payroll records for October 1909 list an E. Stanton, who was scheduled for the night shift but marked as absent, illness. The record confirms his account. But the most significant detail is what Elias said. They opened the door and something came through. What door? And what came through? Elias's statement, recorded over 50 years after the event and filtered through dementia, cannot be considered reliable testimony, but it aligns with other fragments of the story. The tunnel, the sealed chamber, the ancient symbols, and the disappearance of 14 men who went into the building and never came out. Elias was the only surviving witness, and he died without ever being questioned by anyone who understood what he was describing. In 2020, a historian named Dr. Francis Delacroix was granted access to the private archives of the Consolidated Coal Corporation, a conglomerate that had absorbed the Marrow Creek Mining Company in 1935. Among the archived materials was a folder labeled Marrow Creek, Restricted. The folder contained correspondence between Harrison Ludlow, the Marrow Creek superintendent, and executives at the parent corporation. The letters, dated between 1908 and 1910, discussed the discovery of the ancient chamber and the company's response. One letter, dated September 1907, written by Ludlow, described the initial breach. During expansion of Shaft 7, workers encountered a sealed chamber of unknown origin. The chamber contains artifacts and remains that appear to predate modern occupation of the region. I have ordered the chamber sealed and instructed workers to avoid the area. However, I am concerned about the structural integrity of the mine in proximity to this feature. A response letter, dated October 1907, from the corporation's vice president, instructed Ludlow to proceed with caution, document the findings, and ensure no disruption to production. If necessary, construct a controlled access point for further evaluation. This confirms what Samuel Corbin's anonymous source had claimed. The company knew about the chamber in 1907. They built the tunnel to access it, and they chose to continue mining operations despite concerns about safety. But the most revealing letter is dated October 15, 1909, 4 days after the disappearance. Ludlow wrote, "The incident has been contained, 14 workers unaccounted for, no remains recovered, building cleaned and prepared for reopening. Recommends sealing the access tunnel and suspending all work in proximity to the chamber. Further correspondence on this matter should be classified as confidential." The corporation's response, dated October 20, 1909, reads, "Approved. Seal the tunnel, cease all investigation, compensate families as minimally as legally required, ensure no further public discussion." The letters are clear. The company knew what had happened, they knew why it had happened, and they made a deliberate decision to conceal it, to prevent investigation, and to continue operations as if nothing had occurred. Dr. Delacroix's findings were published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2021. The article concluded, "The Marrow Creek Mining Company was aware of the risks posed by the ancient chamber and chose to prioritize profit over worker safety. The disappearance of 14 men was not an accident. It was the direct result of corporate negligence and willful concealment." The article was widely cited. It sparked renewed interest in the case, and it prompted calls for a formal inquiry into the company's actions. But no inquiry was ever opened. The company no longer exists, the executives are long dead, and the legal statute of limitations had expired decades ago. The truth was finally known, but justice was impossible. In 2021, Dr. Sarah Veneman, an archaeologist specializing in pre-Columbian cultures, submitted a formal request to excavate the sealed chamber beneath Marrow Creek. She argued that the site was of significant historical and cultural importance, that it might contain artifacts and remains that could provide insight into the indigenous peoples who had inhabited the region, and that it deserved to be properly documented and preserved. Her request was denied by the landowner, a real estate development firm that had purchased the site in 2015. The firm stated that excavation would pose safety risks, environmental concerns, and potential liability issues. They offered no further explanation. Dr. Veneman appealed the decision. She contacted state and federal agencies, arguing that the site should be protected under cultural heritage laws. She was told that without definitive proof of significant archaeological value, the agencies could not compel the landowner to allow access. Dr. Veneman then attempted to crowdfund an independent survey, hoping to gather enough evidence to justify legal intervention. The campaign raised over $50,000. But before the survey could be conducted, the landowner issued a cease and desist order, threatening legal action if Dr. Veneman or anyone associated with her attempted to enter the property. In an interview conducted in 2022, Dr. Veneman said, "They do not want us to know what is down there. Whether it is because of legal liability or because of something they have already found, I cannot say. But I believe that chamber contains answers, and I believe those answers are being deliberately suppressed." Dr. Veneman has not given up. She continues to advocate for access to the site. She has published papers, given lectures, and organized petitions. But the site remains closed. The chamber remains sealed, and the mystery remains unsolved. And as long as the chamber is sealed, the question will never be answered. What did the 14 men find when they went into the dark? In 2023, a woman named Emily Rourke contacted the Kentucky Historical Society with a discovery. Emily was the great-great-granddaughter of Daniel Rourke, one of the 14 missing men. While cleaning out her grandmother's attic, she had found a small leather diary tucked inside a trunk of old photographs and letters. The diary belonged to Daniel Rourke. It covered the period from August 1909 to October 10, 1909, one day before the disappearance. The entries were brief, written in pencil, often rushed, but they described Daniel's daily life, his work, his family, his struggles to make ends meet. But the final entries, written in late September and early October, were different. They were anxious, fearful. September 24, 1909, "Foreman sent us down the tunnel today. Said we had to move equipment. I do not like going down there. It feels wrong." September 30th, 1909, "Something is in that chamber. I heard it, breathing, moving. The foreman says it is the wind, but it is not the wind." October 7th, 1909, "They are making us work near the chamber again. I told the foreman I would not go. He said if I refused I would be fired. I need this job, but I am afraid." October 10th, 1909, "Tomorrow I work the night shift. I do not want to go, but I have no choice. If I do not come back, tell Mary I love her. Tell her I tried." That was the final entry. Daniel went to work the next day, and he never returned. The diary is now preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archive. It is the only first-hand account of the days leading up to the disappearance, and it confirms what other evidence has suggested. The men knew something was wrong. They were afraid, and they were forced to work near the chamber despite their fear. Emily Rourke, in an interview conducted in 2024, said, My great-great-grandfather did not abandon his family. He did not walk away. He was sent into a place he knew was dangerous, and he never came out. And the company let it happen. They knew. And they did nothing. The diary is open to researchers, and anyone who reads it will understand. The 14 men did not vanish. They were taken. By 2024, the evidence was overwhelming. The tunnel, the ancient chamber, the company's knowledge, the sealed letters, the diary, the testimonies. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. The 14 men disappeared because the Marrow Creek Mining Company breached a sealed chamber in 1907, built a tunnel to access it, and forced workers to labor in proximity to something dangerous and unknown. And in October 1909, that danger manifested. 14 men entered the preparation building, 14 men went into the tunnel, and 14 men never returned. But the evidence, while compelling, is circumstantial. There are no bodies, no remains, no forensic proof. The chamber is sealed, the tunnel is inaccessible, and the company's records, which might have provided definitive answers, were destroyed decades ago. Researchers have proposed multiple theories. Theory 1. The men were killed in an industrial accident, a collapse, an explosion, a gas leak, and the company covered it up to avoid liability. Theory 2. The men discovered something in the chamber, artifacts, remains, evidence of something the company wanted to conceal, and were silenced to protect that secret. Theory 3. The men encountered something in the chamber that was not human, something ancient, something that had been sealed for a reason, and that encounter resulted in their disappearance. None of these theories can be proven. None can be disproven. The truth, if it exists, is buried beneath a hillside in Harlan County, Kentucky, in a chamber that no one is allowed to enter. And as long as the chamber remains sealed, the story will remain unfinished. The question will remain unanswered. And the 14 men will remain lost, suspended between memory and myth, their fate known only to the darkness they entered and never left. On July 18, 1962, the coal preparation building at Marrow Creek caught fire. The cause was officially listed as electrical malfunction, though no investigation was conducted. The fire burned through the night, consuming the timber beams, collapsing the floors, and reducing the structure to a blackened shell. By morning, nothing remained but the brick walls and the foundation. No one was injured. The building had been abandoned for several months, ever since the mine had closed. But the fire was notable for one reason. It burned hotter than it should have. Witnesses reported seeing flames that reached 50 feet into the air, temperatures that melted metal equipment inside the building, and smoke that lingered for days. A retired firefighter interviewed in 1998 said, "I worked that fire. I have fought chemical fires, oil fires, structure fires. But I have never seen anything burn like that building did. It was like the fire was feeding on something we could not see. We poured water on it for hours, and it just kept burning. And when it finally went out, the ground was scorched black for 100 feet around the foundation." The fire destroyed any remaining evidence of what had happened in October 1909. The workstations, the machinery, the walls where handprints had been found, all were consumed, and the tunnel entrance, located in the basement, was buried beneath tons of collapsed rubble. Some researchers believe the fire was accidental. Others believe it was deliberate, that someone, knowing the building might eventually be examined, made sure there was nothing left to find. The site was cleared in 1963. The rubble was removed, the foundation was filled in, and the land was leveled. Today, the site is an empty field, overgrown with weeds, with no marker to indicate that a building once stood there, no monument to the 14 men who vanished, no acknowledgement that anything happened at all. But the chamber beneath the hillside remains, sealed, silent, waiting. In 2015, the descendants of the 14 missing men formed a coalition. They called themselves the Marrow Creek Families Coalition, and their goal was to erect a memorial to honor the men who had disappeared. They raised funds, commissioned a design, and petitioned the county government for permission to place the memorial on public land near the former mine site. The petition was denied. The county commission stated that there was insufficient historical documentation to justify a public memorial and that the site was not suitable for development. The families appealed. The appeal was denied. In 2018, the families attempted to place a small plaque on private land with the permission of the landowner. But before the plaque could be installed, the landowner rescinded permission, citing concerns about attracting unwanted attention to the property. The families have not given up. They continue to meet, to share stories, to preserve the memory of the men who were erased from history. But they have no memorial, no marker, no public acknowledgement of what happened. Emily Rourke, speaking at a coalition meeting in 2023, said, "They want us to forget. They have always wanted us to forget, but we will not. My great-great-grandfather's name was Daniel Rourke, and he deserves to be remembered." The names of the 14 men are Thomas Holloway, Daniel Rourke, Samuel Briggs, Peter Kovac, Henry Dobbs, Jacob Finch, Martin Odell, William Cray, Leonard Moss, Arthur Kane, Charles Whitman, Joseph Brennan, Raymond Hull, Andrew Stiles. 14 names, 14 men, 14 families who have spent over a century waiting for answers. And they are still waiting. Despite the suppression, despite the destroyed records, despite the sealed chamber and the denied memorials, the story of the Marrow Creek disappearance has endured. It has been passed down through families, whispered in mining communities, documented by researchers, and shared online. It has become part of the region's folklore, a cautionary tale about corporate power and human cost. In 2024, a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Chen began production on a film about the disappearance. He interviewed descendants, historians, archaeologists, and former coal miners. He reviewed the archived letters, the diary, the photographs. He visited the site, now an empty field, and stood where the preparation building once stood. Marcus said in an interview, "This story is not just about 14 men who vanished. It is about how truth can be buried, how power can silence, how history can be erased. But it is also about how memory resists erasure, how families refuse to forget, and how eventually the truth finds a way to surface." The documentary is scheduled for release in late 2025. It will be the most comprehensive account of the disappearance ever produced, and it will ensure that the story reaches an audience far beyond Kentucky, far beyond the mining communities where it has been preserved for over a century. But even without the documentary, the story survives, because it is a story that demands to be told, a story that refuses to be silenced, a story that carries the weight of 14 lives that were erased but not forgotten. And as long as someone remembers their names, the story will not die. What happened to the 14 men who entered the coal preparation building on October 11, 1909? The question has been asked for over a century. It has been investigated by reporters, researchers, historians, and archaeologists. It has been the subject of letters, articles, dissertations, and now a documentary. But the question remains unanswered. The evidence suggests they went into the tunnel, that they entered the sealed chamber, that they encountered something there. Something ancient, something dangerous, something that should not have been disturbed, and that they never came out. But what was it? What did they find? And what happened to them? The truth, if it exists, is sealed beneath the earth. It is buried in records that were destroyed. It is hidden behind corporate decisions that were made over a century ago. It is protected by landowners who refuse access, by authorities who refuse to investigate, by a system that has chosen silence over accountability. And so the question remains, and it will remain, until the chamber is opened, until the truth is uncovered, until someone, somewhere, decides that the lives of 14 men matter more than the secrets they died protecting. But that day may never come, and the 14 men may remain forever in the dark, their fate unknown, their story unfinished, their names carved into memory but not into stone. And we are left with the question, the unanswerable question. What happened to them? The families have not forgotten. Even after 115 years, even after the company dissolved, the records were destroyed, the building burned, and the memorials were denied, the descendants of the 14 missing men carry the story forward. They teach it to their children. They preserve the letters, the diaries, the photographs. They meet once a year on October 11th at the site where the preparation building once stood. They gather in the empty field. They speak the names of the men who disappeared. They light candles. They lay flowers. And they stand in silence, honoring the memory of men who were erased from official history, but who live on in the hearts of those who remember them. In 2024, the gathering drew over 200 people. Descendants, researchers, journalists, filmmakers, and members of the public who had heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. Emily Rourke stood at the center of the field and read the names aloud. Thomas Holloway, Daniel Rourke, Samuel Briggs, Peter Kovac, Henry Dobbs, Jacob Finch, Martin Odell, William Cray, Leonard Moss, Arthur Kane, Charles Whitman, Joseph Brennan, Raymond Hull, Andrew Stiles. 14 names, spoken into the air, carried on the wind, remembered. Emily said, "We do not have a memorial. We do not have a marker. We do not have answers, but we have their names. And as long as we speak their names, they are not forgotten. They are here. They are with us, and they always will be." The gathering ended at dusk. The candles burned low, the people dispersed, and the field returned to silence. But the memory remained, and it will remain, because the descendants will not let it die, and neither will we. The ancient chamber beneath Marrow Creek remains sealed. It has been sealed for over a century. It may remain sealed for another century, or longer. The landowner will not allow access. The authorities will not intervene. And the truth, if it exists, remains buried in the dark. But the chamber is still there. The tunnel is still there. And whatever the 14 men found when they entered it, whatever took them, whatever silenced them, whatever made them disappear, is still there, waiting. Geologists who have surveyed the site report anomalies, unexplained density readings, electromagnetic disturbances, temperature variations that do not match the surrounding geology. Some dismiss these as natural phenomena, quirks of the karst landscape. Others are not so sure. Dr. Sarah Veneman, who continues to advocate for excavation, said in 2024, "I have studied ancient sites across North America. I have examined burial mounds, ritual chambers, sacred caves, and I have never encountered a site like this. There is something in that chamber that does not belong to any known archaeological context, and I believe it is still active, still present, still waiting." She was asked what she meant by active. She said, "I mean that whatever the indigenous peoples sealed in that chamber, whatever they marked with their symbols and their warnings, is not a relic. It is not a passive artifact. It is something that can still affect the world. And I believe the 14 men learned that. And I believe we are fortunate that we have not learned it ourselves." Dr. Veneman's statement is speculation, but it is grounded in decades of research, in the evidence gathered from the site, and in the testimonies of those who were there. And it raises a question that no one wants to ask, but that must be asked. If the chamber is opened, what will be found, and what will be released? The chamber waits. And as long as it remains sealed, the question remains unanswered. But the chamber is patient. It has waited for centuries, and it can wait for centuries more. It is October 11th, 2024. 115 years since 14 men entered the coal preparation building at Marrow Creek and never returned. 115 years since the machinery ran unattended through the night. 115 years since the families began waiting for answers that never came. The mine is gone. The building is gone. The company is gone. The records are destroyed. The witnesses are dead. And the chamber remains sealed. But the story endures. It endures in the letters preserved in archives, in the diary written by a man who knew he might not return, in the testimonies of families who refused to forget, in the research conducted by historians, archaeologists, and journalists who believed the truth mattered, and it endures in the empty field where the descendants gather each year, speaking the names of men who were erased from history but who live on in memory. Thomas Holloway, Daniel Rourke, Samuel Briggs, Peter Kovac, Henry Dobbs, Jacob Finch, Martin Odell, William Cray, Leonard Moss, Arthur Kane, Charles Whitman, Joseph Brennan, Raymond Hull, Andrew Stiles. 14 men, 14 names, 14 stories that ended in silence. But that silence is not empty. It is full of unanswered questions, full of suppressed truth, full of the weight of lives that mattered, that were taken, and that have never been accounted for. The investigation continues. The petitions for access continue. The calls for a memorial continue, and the families continue to wait, because waiting is all they can do. Waiting and remembering and refusing to let the story die. The chamber remains sealed. The truth remains hidden. And the darkness that took 14 men remains undisturbed deep beneath the earth, patient and silent and waiting. Waiting for the day someone decides that truth matters more than silence, that justice matters more than profit, that 14 lives matter more than corporate secrecy. Until that day, the story remains unfinished. The question remains unanswered, and the 14 men remain in the dark where they have been for over a century. Still there, still waiting. Still calling out from the silence, hoping that someone, somewhere, will finally listen.